Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airline pilot, and welcome to the next tutorial in our Flight Sim Studio Boeing 727 series. On this one we're going to do the takeoff from runway 06 in Edinburgh, as well as fly our climb to roughly 10,000 feet. So let's go right into it. So we're going to start with a little bit of theory actually. So the 727 is a bit different from other aircraft. It does not have an auto throttle that could automatically set your takeoff thrust, so you got to do that manually. And we also have a flight profile that is slightly different from other aircraft's flight profiles. So let's quickly go over that with a bit of theory. Now, in order to set your takeoff thrust, the first thing you might notice is that if you get a takeoff configuration warning, like that, stop the takeoff and check the position of the flaps, your speed brake lever, which has to be fully forward, so do not arm the speed brake, don't do this. This is not going to work. Keep it fully forward. The trim has to be set within the green takeoff band, and the parking brake has to be released. That would be indications for your takeoff configuration warning system. So if you get that sound, abort the takeoff and check that your aircraft system configuration is okay. Now, we need to set our thrust manually, and that means initially increase to approximately 1.4 EPR, and thereafter push it forward all the way to the EPR buck that we have set during our takeoff calculation. Now, during the takeoff, your EPR is slightly going to change, so readjust the thrust as necessary, but ensure that takeoff EPR is initially set between 40 and 80 knots. Once takeoff EPR is set, only make very small inputs on your thrust levers to readjust the EPR as necessary. Now, V1 and VR are both at the same buck over here, both at 132 knots. So, reaching that buck, we're going to rotate smoothly and steadily to 15 degrees pitch, or the value that we've gotten from the manuals earlier on. Remember, we had 16 to 17 degrees pitch. Ensure that your speed stays within V2 to V2 plus 10, so within those two speed bucks that we've set over here. From there on, we can initially fly our climb. And we're going to climb until we are 1,000 feet above field elevation while maintaining the speed between V2 and V2 plus 10. Remember, that is why we set that white buck over here to our field elevation. So once the altimeter has done its first round and reaches the white buck, that is when we are going to pitch down to 7.5 degrees. So you go from 15 to 7.5 and start the acceleration. As the airplane accelerates, retract your flaps on schedule. The flap retraction schedule, independent of the aircraft gross weight, is 15 to 5 at 160 knots, 5 to 2 at 180 knots, and 2 to up at 190 knots. When the speed reaches 200, maintain 200 knots by pitching to about 12.5 degrees and continue the climb at 200 knots. Reaching 1,500 feet above field elevation, so that's basically when the needle is on the opposite of the white buck. At 1,500 above field elevation, we're going to reduce our thrust for noise abatement reasons, and we are going to reduce it to 1.7. Continue the climb until we reach 3,000 above ground, and reaching 3,000 feet, so that's again at the white buck, 3,000 above field elevation, we continue to accelerate towards 250 knots, and we set our climb thrust, which we've marked on the third EPR gauge over here, as 1.84. The autopilot can be engaged at 1,100 feet above the ground, so basically when the altimeter is 100 feet above this one on the first 1,000. Now, let's talk about the autopilot modes next. The autopilot is rather basic. With the switches set up like they are right now, basically all in the 12 o'clock position, once you engage the autopilot over here, it is going to maintain wings level and the current vertical speed at the time of the engagement. So basically, this means that our autopilot is just going to maintain whatever attitude the aircraft currently had, and or roll wings level if it was not wings level before. In order to track our navigation, we got a couple different settings here on the right side. So if the nav selector is in the turn knob position, then it's going to follow the bank angle commanded from this knob over here. If it is a nav or localizer, it is going to follow the VOR radial, the localizer, or with the nav GPS switch set to GPS, it is going to follow the GPS course in the nav log position. If you're flying with an INS and once you want to navigate on the INS, select auxiliary navigation, as that is going to follow the INS. Arm altitude select as needed so that your airplane is actually going to level off, or use heading select as needed. And in order to use heading select, the nav selector should be in the middle in the turn knob position. On the left side we got our vertical controls. The 12 o'clock position is vertical speed. With that, the airplane is simply going to maintain the vertical speed that it had at the moment when it was engaged. You can adjust that vertical speed using the wheel over here. If you no longer want to maintain the current vertical speed but want to maintain it to maintain an indicated airspeed, you can use the IAS hold button, but be aware that this only maintains the indicated airspeed you had at the time when you engaged it. So you cannot change that speed. You can only maintain what you had when you engaged it. The same goes for Mach hold down here, which is only going to be used in the higher flight levels. So that much about the theory of what's available for our takeoff. The last thing we gotta do, and that we should do as we are preparing for our takeoff, is to mentally review our standard instrument departure. So remember, at 0.5 DME or 640, whichever is earlier, left turn heading 044 until 3 DME, and then left turn 257, bearing inbound to Glasgow VOR. And my recommendation on a standard departure like this would be to engage the autopilot once you're established on this radial inbound over here, or once you're established on this heading over here. So only turn on the autopilot when the aircraft is in a stabilized flight path, and not, for example, as you are currently changing the pitch to accelerate or while you're turning over here. That's my recommendation. So, this was a lot of stuff. Let's just review the takeoff profile before we're going to fly it. Stabilize at 1.4. Set takeoff thrust, maintain takeoff thrust, you will have to do this manually. Rotate at VR, climb, initial pitch 15 degrees, climb between V2 and V2 plus 10. 1000 above the ground, pitch down to start the acceleration. And 1500 above ground, reduce EPR to 1.7. Retract the flaps on schedule, which is select flaps 5 at 160, select flaps 2 at 180, select flaps 1 at flaps up at 190. 3000 AGL, accelerate towards 250, prior to that maintain 200. 3000 AGL, accelerate 250, set climb thrust, which we bucked at 184 over here. So that much for the theory. All of that out of the way, let's go ahead and release that park and brake and go flying. So, takeoff. Stabilized at 1.4. EPR set at 2.0. Slide nose down elevator, maintain the center line. Tracked, elevator neutral. Maintain the EPR, you can see it went slightly down there, so I'm increasing a bit. Rotate. So 15 degrees pitch, positive rate, gear up. Trim the airplane out. Maintain the speed between V2 and V2 plus 10. And as you can see, those 16 degrees pitch that we figured out from the chart before the flight works pretty well. Reaching 1000 above ground, we are going to pitch down 7.5 degrees to start the acceleration. Also we can do our left turn towards 044 degrees. Passing 160, flaps 5. So 1500 AGL, that went a bit quick here. EPR 1.7. Passing 180, flaps 2. And passing 190, flaps up. Reaching 3 VME, make the left hand turn onto the radial, maintain 200 until 3000 above the field. So basically now, and 3000 above the field, we can pitch down, accelerate towards 250, and set climb thrust 1.84. Here we go, all set. Okay, set your speed bug according to the speed you want to fly. 250 in our case, which we have right now. So, all we got to do now is establish on the radial. As you can see, slight overshoot, not much of a problem. So, re-intercepting that radial right over here, maintain the speed at about 250, and passing transition altitude, which is 6000 over here, set altimeters to standard. And remember to set all three of them whenever you have the chance to do so. Pretty much, the first officer just needs to do his on his own. So right now we're in a wings level straight ahead situation, and this one would be pretty good to engage the autopilot. So autopilot engage switch comes on, we are going to follow the radial, so select nav lock, arm altitude select, and as our speed is where we want it to be, we are going to engage indicated airspeed hold. Passing through 10,000, we can start the acceleration towards 300 knots. So we go back to vertical speed mode, use the pitch wheel to pitch it down to start the acceleration. So let's use a moderate rate of climb here, something like 1000 feet a minute, which we have now. Place the speed bug at 300 as a reminder. And now we're accelerating. As soon as our speed reaches the target 300 knots, we are going to turn the autopilot back into indicated airspeed hold, and then we are going to follow that particular airspeed. So let's do things slowly. Reaching 300, IAS hold, and now the airplane is going to pitch to maintain that airspeed. With all of that out of the way, let's do the level 100 flows. Landing gear, off. Landing lights, off. Taxi lights, off. Fasten seatbelt sign, as necessary, we are going to switch it off over here. Last but not least, we move over to the flight engineers panel. And over here, ensure that the aircraft is pressurizing properly. So you can see differential pressure is building, the cabin is climbing, and the cabin altitude is also climbing. We go up and set the pack trip into the cutout position. And last but not least, we are going to operate the cooling doors as needed. So the schedule for operating the pack cooling doors is as follows. Basically, at or below 10,000 feet, you should have them half closed. Between 10 to 18,000 feet, you should have them 3/4 closed. So let's go ahead and start doing that. Basically, you want to maintain the pack temperature with those doors. So between 10 and 18,000, Gonna set those to 3/4 closed. And the pack temperature, the one you see on the upper two dials over there, should be changing. My apologies for that. With the version that I'm using to record this, unfortunately those needles are static. But you can find the correct schedule in the product manual online. So, going back to the front then, to where we are currently navigating, let's go ahead and take a look at where we need to initiate our turn. So, over here you can see at 17 DME from Golf Oscar Whiskey, that's waypoint Combo, we gotta turn left onto 217 inbound to Turnberry towards waypoint Gozan. So right now we're at about 19 DME, so in 2 nautical miles we gotta start that left-hand turn. While all of that is ongoing, keep a look at your engine EPR, and what I can recommend is that about every 5,000 feet in the climb you take a look at the product manual again and at the maximum thrust charts to verify what the current maximum thrust should be. So we're approaching 17 miles. Let's go ahead and enter heading select mode, start that left-hand turn towards 217, and now we can switch over, Turnberry down here, and intercept course 217. Here it is. And now we can use the Autopilot again to capture the nav mode and capture the radial inbound to Gozan. Now Gozan is located at 34.8 DME from Turnberry. We're currently at 43 DME, so this is a good point for us to switch over to our INS navigation. So let's do the following. We rotate the mode selector back towards distance and time. You can see up here we are 7 miles from waypoint Gozan, which we entered as number 1. Just to be sure that we intercept the correct track, let's go to waypoint change and enter a direct to Gozan. So from waypoint 0, which is our present position, to waypoint 1, hit insert, and now we can go ahead and couple the INS by bringing the switch to the auxiliary nav position, and now the aircraft is going to navigate using the INS. And with that, we have basically established ourselves along our route. We have captured our flight plan path, and now we are just flying along into the direction of our destination. Now, throughout the climb, readjust the climb thrust as needed. So right now we're in 22,000 feet, the temperature is 0 degrees centigrade. So what we can do is to go to the table section from the manual once again, which you can find in here. Look for the maximum climb thrust table, and now you can see at an altitude of between 6,000 and 25,000, temperature 0, we should have a maximum climb thrust right now of 1.97. So we can go ahead and increase our engine thrust to 1.97. And like that, you can reset your climb thrust as you go along and make your way up into the higher flight levels. Now, whenever possible, if you have any VORs along your route, do tune them as a conventional backup so that you can cross-check that your INS is navigating correctly. What's also really handy as we are flying along is to have a look into your en route charts in order to monitor your flight's progress. So right now, for example, we're doing a rather steep left-hand turn over here. So we can go ahead and look at our en route chart over here, and indeed we can see that at waypoint Fennec, which is number 2 in our flight plan, we should do a rather steep left turn towards Lusiv, and thereafter on towards Elros, and so on. Now as you can see, this airway over here seems to be based off Glasgow VOR, and it's on radial 152 outbound Glasgow VOR 115.4. So what I recommend, whenever you're flying this airplane, do tune this conventional backup. So I just set a 152 in here. And then we can go ahead and tune Glasgow VOR, which is 115.4, so we can switch that one active again. Now you can see basically how we are intercepting that radial outbound based upon the INS navigation. And that's about as easy as it gets. Now, unfortunately in the modern world, many airways are just based purely on area navigation and no longer on VORs. In the UK where we are flying right now, we are lucky there are still a lot of VORs along the route. Not so much in the rest of the world, so that's just something to keep in mind there. Whenever you can, back up your INS navigation by using the VORs, but if it is not possible to do that, because there are no VORs, then, well, you gotta trust the INS for that. Now, the INS is capable of doing position updates along the route. I do not think that Flight Sim Studios have implemented the automatic position monitoring at this point, so unfortunately we gotta leave that one out of the tutorial. Continuing with our climb though, we are maintaining 300 knots until basically we are reaching our cruise Mach number. Some airlines reduce their climb speed from 300 knots towards 290 knots when passing 20,000 feet of altitude. Now, not all airlines do that. For that reason, it's not mandatory to do. However, it is something that you can take into consideration if you want to improve your climb performance a little bit. Now, just to show you how that is done. Right now we're climbing with the Autopilot engaged in indicated airspeed hold mode. Now, as I mentioned earlier, IAS hold has no way of changing the indicated airspeed that it currently maintains. So your only way of changing the airspeed is to revert to vertical speed mode. Now the airplane is simply maintaining the current vertical speed, and now by turning your trim wheel or your vertical speed wheel up a little bit, you can increase your rate of climb, which of course in turn leads to a speed decrease. And once your speed has decreased to the desired speed, we can go ahead and return to IAS hold. So we're at about 290 knots right now. Let's engage IAS hold again. And now the airplane is maintaining those 290 knots as recommended in the FSS manual as well. Again, the sim brief schedule is based on 300 knots without the speed reduction. The Flight Sim Studio manual on the other hand side recommends to use this. Basically, whatever floats your boat, both are acceptable, but if you want to improve your climb performance, you do get slightly better climb performance if you use 290 rather than 300. Again, as we're climbing, periodically do monitor your cabin altitude gauges, so we can see we have differential pressure 7.6, cabin altitude at 5,000, and it's still climbing. But basically, as we can see down here at 33,000, 4,800 is the target cabin altitude, so it's more or less reached its target at this point already. So, like this, you continue all the way to cruise. The last thing you do, as you get into the higher altitudes, is to change over from maintaining a constant indicated airspeed to maintaining a constant Mach number. And that is pretty easy to do. You take the pitch selector and switch it from IAS hold over to Mach hold. Now, the recommended transition is from 300 or 290 knots respectively directly to the cruise Mach number. The cruise Mach number for us is planned as Mach 0.80, so once our Mach meter over here reaches our current indicated airspeed needle over here, and the Mach number is slowly going to increase with increasing altitude at a constant indicated airspeed, basic ATPL knowledge there, then we are going to switch over to Mach hold, and the airplane is going to climb at the Mach number that we had at that point. Last but not least, ensure as you approach your cleared altitude that altitude select is indeed armed, and that's the little switch down here. So altitude select needs to be armed in order for the airplane to intercept the altitude you've dialed in over here. Last but not least, another cross-check. So we've got minus 10 degrees right now at an altitude of 30,000 feet. So once again, we can go into the manual and have a look at the chart, which we have over here. So we're looking at 30,000 feet, temperature minus 10. So that's 2.05 EPR on the pod engines, 2.1 on the center engines. So we can go ahead and set that number. Make only small inputs to your thrust levers so that you get the respective engine responses. So with all of that good stuff now out of the way, we can go ahead and relax a little bit. But we could already work a little bit up front. So looking at our en route chart, the next VOR we have along our route is going to be Dean Cross over here, 115.2. So let's go ahead and start tuning Dean Cross on 115.2. Can switch that active, and indeed it's just changed over. So we now have the DME from Dean Cross here at 9 nautical miles. Reaching our target Mach number here, Mach 0.8. Mach hold is engaged. And now the airplane should start pitching up and climb a little bit faster. Right now the FSS airplane seems to accelerate to exactly the Mach number. So it's a little bit too precise, but it will start pitching up in a few moments and continue the climb to its cruising level. So this is basically all there is to it, to the climb. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that you found this one interesting. Let me know your feedback in the comments below. With all of that, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching. Like, comment and subscribe if you're up for more. And finally, if you really like what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and I see you all again on the next one.